week we talked about how Paul, who wrote the majority of the New Testament, at times chose to be simple. And just to background, a little bit of background, Paul was a very smart person, very smart, very intellectual, had all the skills to teach at a very high university level. But sometimes he used that skill, and then other times he put that skill on the shelf. And last week, the basic premise was we looked at how Paul chose to be simple. And we first said this: simple is not stupid. We second said this: simple is focused. Paul chose to be simple on purpose, and he stuck with it. He didn't jump back to the complicated. He stuck with the simple. He was focused on it. And then we looked at how Paul was intentional. He was simple on purpose. He was simple because he wanted people not to believe in his words and his logic, but he wanted people to believe in the power of God. Because if we rely on our logic and our words and our teachings, and we expect people to come to know Jesus because of our teachings, then we're relying way too much on our own strengths. And so Paul, at times, was simple on purpose, so that God could be revealed. And if you think about it, there may not have been this logical argument that began your faith journey with Jesus. There was this point where you learned about it, it made sense to you, but there was this point where you're like, okay, I believe. And for many of us, that point, if in all reality, if we step back, we're like, that was kind of the emotions attached to that moment. So a lot of times that point where we accept Jesus and believe that this guy died and rose from the grave, it's hard to really explain. I mean, to make it, prove it. For someone who needs proof, it would be hard for you to prove your faith and to prove all of the things that go on in that. And so Paul intentionally does this, and then today we're going to look at how Paul chose to be relevant. Paul chose to be relevant. And we mentioned that last week. And here's the definition of relevant. I looked this up in the dictionary, and here's what it said in the dictionary that I have. I know there's a million dictionaries out there, but here's what it said. Relevant means this: closely connected or appropriate to the matter at hand. And I'm going to give you an example in just a minute of how Paul at one time chose to be relevant. Okay, relevant though is this word that I don't want to throw it around like it's some new thought. All right, there's this thing that a lot of younger people are doing. They're saying the church isn't relevant. They'll say that, and the old people are like, yeah, we are. The older people, the older in the church are like, yes, we are. We're relevant. And so the new people are like, you need to be relevant. And so there's just like this tension that goes on. Relevant is not a new word. It's not a new idea. It just means, look, connect with people. It means stay connected with them. It means be appropriate to the matter at hand. For example, in our community, there are some things that are right in front of us that we can talk about, that everybody in this community would connect with. One, let's just say it, the natural disasters that have been happening lately. Everybody in this community, that is a matter at hand. That is it. There you go. If you want to be relevant to an issue, here's another one. Voting. Just so you know, if you aren't prepared to vote or aren't thinking through voting, you should be. That's coming up very soon. Okay, you need to be ready for that. Some issues you really need to think through is the issue of poverty on our islands, specifically our island. Not just poverty, but how people in leadership attempt to help these poor people get jobs. And then those people who are working, how those people get jobs that actually pay enough to provide for a family. And so you need to think through those as you go. Issues, biblical issues that people in leadership are promoting that are different, redefining things. There are all sorts of ways for you to think through and vote. That is relevant. That is relevant to what's going on in our world. There are all sorts of other ideas. People going through divorce, because that is happening in our community all the time. People who are young and inexperienced and unwise, they don't have the wisdom that usually comes with age, but having families very early on in life, it's difficult. It's hard. Those are relevant things. They're just struggles, that everyone has. Everyone has, and those are relevant issues for you and me to think about. And so, if the issue is communication, then maybe we should be simple and communicate about things that are relevant. If the issue is how to live, then maybe we should live in a way that's connected or appropriate to the matters at hand. Paul in Acts chapter 17, there's this really cool thing that happens. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn there. Acts chapter 17. And we're going to be reading from verses 16 and then kind of skipping around to the end of the chapter. So first, let's read verse 16. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. See, Paul had been journeying from city to city, and he was teaching about Jesus, and then last week we talked about this. The Jews some of the Jews were creating this mob that was causing trouble for him and other believers at that time. And so the early church was not just persecuted by outsiders, but it was persecuted by the root faith sometimes of where we came from. And so there were some Jews causing trouble for people who were beginning to learn about Jesus. And so Paul winds up in Athens. And he's moved, he's provoked, because he sees something that's going on. The matter at hand for him was he saw a city filled with idols. If you go to Athens today, you still see statues everywhere, carvings everywhere, artwork everywhere of all sorts of idols. And here's the interesting thing about idols, and here's basically the very basic. Man created these things to worship. Here's what's so messed up. Man created these things to worship, but man was created by something else. And so instead of man worshiping its creator, man worships something that it created. It's so weird, but that's what happened. And over and over and over again, it took place. And so this bothered Paul. And it should have. And when we see people falling into those kind of traps and falling into the temptations and going through life's troubles or literally worshiping false idols, maybe our spirit might be provoked to do something. And as you read on in 17, verses 17 to 22, what you'll find is Paul began to speak up. And he began to teach. And then all the really smart intellectual people are saying, man, this guy's talking about some new God. And they were intrigued by the way he taught. And in this case, he wasn't necessarily talking simply. He was talking in a very relevant way to the city filled with all these intellectual people. And so they said, Paul is teaching this new teaching. And so they brought him in the midst of all of these smart people. They brought him in, and so all these smart professors, if you will, are staring at him. And the story picks up, and we're going to read at verse 23. And here's what Paul says in front of all those people. Okay. They brought him in, and they want to hear what he has to say. And he says this, while I was passing through Athens, and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. Here he begins to just tell them. Here he begins to tell them. Here's what he says. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. He's observed all these things made by these people. He's saying the God who created everything, he doesn't dwell in these statues and these temples and these carvings that you've made. Nor is he served by human hands, although he is served by human hands. But he's not served by human hands as though he needed them. And that's important for you to understand, because whenever you make something to worship, you have to make it. You have to wipe it down when it gets dirty. You know, if you make a statue, you have to dust it and take care of it. If a natural disaster is coming, you have to pick up your idol and move it out of the way of the lava. Or you have to pick up this thing that you created as if it can't take care of itself. And Paul is making a bold statement. He's saying, look, you have all these things that you worship. But there's a God who doesn't need your help. He doesn't need you to carry him on your back. He doesn't need you to create him. since he himself gives to all people life and breath on all things. And he made from one man, he begins to tell them about this, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. In him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. And this is a really interesting thing, just so you know. Paul here, he quotes some of their literature. He says, you've even said we're the children of our Creator. But you have this city with all these idols that so they've said in their poems that we're the children of a God. And yet we have all these things that are kind of the children of us, and they're worshiping them. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, all of these carvings and idols. That's what they were made from. We ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. And so Paul says, look, you have all this stuff. This is the matter at hand. You have all these idols. But you created that. That's not God. But there is a God who created us. And so Paul chose to be relevant to these people. That's an example of communicating in a way that's relevant, that's on point. That's like what they're going through, what Paul's going through. It was closely connected to what was going on in their world. And now, I bring that up because I don't want us just to stop there and say, cool, Paul, that's a great job. But I want this to really connect with us and on a very practical level. As a pastor, one of the jobs that I have is to teach. But also, knowing that, I'm a teacher, I teach sometimes. In addition to teaching, though, I'm supposed to be being taught too, And something that's been taught to me recently is what I'm about to teach you next. It's something that I was convicted, changed about. It changed in me. And it's very relevant to what's going on. In fact, it's always been relevant and it will always be relevant. But in the midst of our church, as we've got to this place in time, and as we see stuff happening in our community, and we see families that we know going through different struggles and different things, and people battling all of these issues, I want us to flip in our Bibles to Luke chapter 10, and we're going to read a familiar parable. And you may have heard all of this before. But if you've heard it all before and forgotten about it, maybe we should be reminded. So the issue today that I want to address is, what is the matter at hand for us as individuals? How do we live? So last week was communication, right? This week is, how do we live in such a way that connects with or addresses or relates to the matters at hand in our context here. Paris Park, Analoa, whatever you want to call Puna area. How do we live? And so here's how the scripture begins. It's Luke chapter 10, verse 25. And here's what we find. A lawyer stood up and put him is Jesus, to the test. So Jesus has been teaching. There are people kind of gathered around listening to Jesus, and people trying to test Jesus. And so the lawyer stands up and he says, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And this response that Jesus says, a lot of people aren't comfortable, but here's what Jesus said. He says, "What's written in the law? How does it read to you?" I don't know about you, but that's one of those statements where it's like, so Jesus, you're asking his opinion? Maybe, maybe not. You're asking for his interpretation? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, Jesus is responding to his question with a question. And at the end of the day, Jesus probably knew that he was a lawyer or someone who should have been familiar with the text, right? The Bible at their time. And so maybe by Jesus asking this question, he knew the person already kind of knew the conclusion they already come to. And so Jesus says, what's written in the law? How does it read to you? So then the lawyer answers and says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And your neighbor as yourself. Oh, by the way, that's why on some of our documentation we put loving God, because Jesus says it's the greatest commandment. You know, that's one thing you should do. And then he follows that up with love your neighbor, love people. That's why it's on there. We also have this little statement, living his word. You know, and I've talked about this to you before, and it's because, well, we think the word is where we learn how to do that. So we try our very best to do that as well. So here we are. And Jesus, the lawyer responds to that, and he says those things, and that's good. And so Jesus says, all right, you know the scripture. Very good. You can recite it to me. That's great. You can speak the words to me. Oh, that's awesome. That's not what Jesus says, though. What he actually says is, you have answered correctly. Do this. He says, do this, and you will live. But the lawyer asked another question, a question that many of us want to know. But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? It's a really good question. You know, who is it? Is it the people that live next door? Is it people who live on our street? Is there like this definition of neighbor that once we love that definition, then we're done loving people? Is it the people only on the Big Island? I mean, and so that's is there like some status or some measurable quota of people that we can love, and then we've done enough, right? You know, in order to justify ourselves, what that means is we want to make ourselves right. You know, we want to know what's enough. And many of us, myself included, like checklists. You know, and we want to know when I've done enough to make sure I've accomplished what I need to accomplish. And probably part of the motive of this lawyer, not only to test Jesus, but to find out what is enough. What can I do that will give me eternal life? What's the measurable distance of people that I'm supposed to meet? Here's how Jesus answers. He answers with a parable. Just so you know, a parable is a story that teaches. A parable is probably one of the most relevant ways to communicate ever, because it takes things that are appropriate, that are connected with the people that are going on there. And in the room, there were priests and Jews and probably some Levites, and those are some of the characters in the parable that he's about to tell. And so parables are probably the best way to do it. And I want to read to you what Jesus says. So Jesus replies, and here's how the story begins. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. The geography is there's kind of a steep path. Okay, this path they were going on, there were little cliffs and little ravines, and so robbers would hang out on this road, and they would surprise travelers and do what they did to this person. Notice here that this man does not have a gender. He has a gender. He doesn't have an ethnicity. He doesn't have a religious background. Just a man. Right here. And he fell among robbers, and they stripped him. They took his clothes, and they beat him. And they went away, leaving him half dead. So it's not like he could have called for help, right? They didn't have cell phones back then. He was half dead. He couldn't walk. He couldn't crawl. Not only that, but he was naked. Probably the most vulnerable you could be. I remember one time I was riding a dirt bike and I fell, had a wreck. And not only does it hurt your pride, which is totally different than this, but you're in so much pain when like you've hurt yourself. You know, you've been going fast, you hit something, you skid on the ground, and you're just like, your adrenaline kicks in, and you're just kind of like shaking. You can barely pick the bike up off the ground. This guy was hurting, half dead, a lot more dead than I was when I got in the accident. And by chance, and here's another story to use, and by chance, a priest, you better believe that was put there by Jesus on purpose, using this character. A priest was going down the same road, and by chance, just by chance, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So the priest didn't touch the guy. Went along. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him pass by on the other side. And the third person, but a Samaritan who, in the midst of the crowd that Jesus was talking to, would have raised some eyebrows. You see, Samaritans, to many racist Jews, were half-breeds with Gentile blood. They were mutts. They were just like, they were viewed as a negative. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion. And he came to him, and he bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. Oil, medicinal properties. It's not necessarily medicine, but oil, from what I've heard, is one of those things that protects wounds from bugs and other stuff. And wine is like alcohol, right? Antiseptic. Doctors, don't correct me right now if I'm wrong. I just read it in the book. Okay? But you better believe that caused him a little discomfort, right? Wine on open wounds, that wouldn't feel very good, I don't think. He put him on his own beast, his own animal, and he brought him to an inn, and he took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you, I'll reimburse you for any extra expenses that may take place." And then the question that many of you know, and that those of you who've heard this parable, those of you who've been in church any time at all, is what Jesus says. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? He doesn't define neighbor, does he? He doesn't say, who is our neighbor? He doesn't say, your neighbor is, and then fill in the blank. He instead tells a parable that teaches how to be a neighbor, which is much different. And so the lawyer says, the one who showed mercy toward him. Remember the question, which of these 3 proved to be a neighbor? And the one who was being a neighbor was the one who showed mercy. And Jesus says, go and do the same. So the question, does Jesus answer the question, who is my neighbor? In my opinion, no. Or does Jesus give an example to follow? And I would say circle the bottom where that's the one that he does. And what's so overwhelming about this is that you can't check off a list. You can't justify yourself with a definition of neighbor. There's not a certain people group or a certain region of people that we're supposed to or need to. And once we've loved them, we're done. You know, it's like as we're on a journey, right? The Samaritan was on a journey. We don't know where the Samaritan was going or what he was up to or how much of a pain it was to actually stop or how much out of the way he had to go to actually do what he was doing. But what we do know is that he stopped and he was a neighbor to the person. And so the conclusion today, and to wrap up, is this: how will you be a neighbor? And I think this is such a huge thing because it's convicted me in numerous ways. But as a church, Think about this. You know people, and I know people who are all broken and messed up. They may not literally have cuts on them, right? They may not literally be on the side of the road naked. But they might have all these hurts and wounds that need to be bandaged up. And I don't know the best way to accomplish being a neighbor to these people in every scenario, because I'm not you in those scenarios, but you do. Maybe it's just putting an arm around somebody whose family just fell apart. Divorce, or financially a family just got ruined because they lost a job. Or they had a job, or now they're having to work 4 jobs to provide for their family, and it's causing so much stress, and it's just causing so many issues that it's just all hurting. Maybe that's somebody that you're supposed to be a neighbor to. Maybe there's somebody that really is struggling with an addiction. And you know that you should point them in the right direction. Give them a number to call, or take them to a place where they can get help, or I don't know. Maybe you know somebody that you're supposed to be a neighbor to. And it may make you uncomfortable. And it might cause you to have to do something out of that messes up your schedule. And you know what I think will happen? I think in the midst of all the trauma that our community has had, there'll be a lot of people being neighbor to someone else. And you'll see it happening because you'll be being a neighbor. And then somebody else might see that you were being a neighbor or whatever, but who knows? Who knows? See, that's what's so cool, is that we don't do it because we want somebody to see us. We do it because we want to make our Father in heaven happy. And we want to make our Father in heaven happy, but we also want to be there for people because people have been there for us. And we want to accept the grace, but not just keep saying, give me more grace, give me more grace, give me more grace. We want to take that grace and share it with others. I can't imagine what will happen in our community. I can't imagine what will happen in your lives, but I'm looking forward to hearing maybe in the next few weeks about ways that you've been able to do this. Maybe you sent an email, hey, God opened this door for me to be a neighbor. Send me an email, tell me about it so we can share it with each other. But at the end of the day, what did Jesus say to the guy after the parable? When the guy said, it's the one who showed mercy, what did Jesus say? He said what? Go and do it. And that's dangerous, right? Have the crowd say it, that's very dangerous. That's right. Go and do. So, look, here it is. Go and do like that Samaritan. And if there was a mirror here, I'd be pointing at me too, right?